This build was a true lockdown project. I was able to build the entire stand from materials I already had in the shop. I didn't even need to go to the store once. The sides were made from this pine board that was close to 25mm thick. I think it was the top of an old cupboard. I measured and marked out the sides, making sure to cut away some splitting on the ends and a defect near one edge. I first trimmed off the roundover on one side and then ripped it to final width. I then cut the board to final length, which was the height of the stand, before cutting the taper with a track saw to get the two sides. I cleaned up the back edges of the sides to get rid of the saw marks. And then with the two sides clamped together, I jointed the tapered front edges so the two sides were identical. I paid particular attention to the grain direction here, so I was jointing downhill or with the grain. Using a template I made out of MDF just for this step, I traced and cut out an arc at the bottom of the sides to give me 2 feet rather than the entire bottom edge of the stand having to sit on the ground. I then used the same template to cut the final shape on the router table. The screws holding the template were strategically placed where the bottom shelf will be installed. I used a double bearing straight bit here so that I could once again make sure I was cutting with the grain by turning the piece over and doing one half of the cut at a time. I also used the router table to cut the groove for the bottom shelf, which was made from 19mm pine. I couldn't use the same method to cut the top groove for the upper shelf because the ends of the side pieces were too narrow to run along the fence safely. So I clamped the two together and just nailed on a straight edge to use the handheld router. The stand was getting a painted finish, so any small holes would just get filled with filler and sanded. I took a couple of passes to cut the groove and just repositioned the straight edge to get the width I needed. I cut some holes of different diameters in the sides using different sized hole saws, purely for aesthetics, but I completely forgot to film it. To sand the insides of the holes, I made a sanding spindle for the drill press out of the cutouts from the smaller hole, and it worked a treat. The top shelf needed a number of cutouts along the front edge for the clubs to rest into. So to do that, I cut a series of holes with a hole saw, drilling through from both sides so there was no tear out. And then I ripped the board to width through the middle of those holes. A bit of sandpaper wrapped around the dowel worked well to smooth out the hole saw marks. I smoothed over all the edges with a small round over bit and then added the last piece, which was a lip at the back of the shelf so any items placed on there wouldn't fall off the back. For the bottom shelf, I didn't have anything wide enough, so I edge glued 2 boards together. Once that was dry, I trimmed it to width. The bottom shelf got a lip on the front for the clubs to rest against while they were standing up in the stand. I then trimmed the shelf to final dimension, and that cut off was later attached to the rear of the shelf. I rounded over all the edges on the sides ready for assembly. And then with the shelf in place, I marked the position for the screws and drilled pilot holes. Then it was time to glue and screw it into place using the top of my bench to keep the shelf and the sides flush at the back. A couple of small infill pieces finished off that front edge. I used one of my clamps as a spreader to open up the sides at the top just slightly so I didn't wipe off all the glue on the ends of the shelf when sliding it into place. I plugged all the screw holes with dowels and cut them off flush. I gave the stand a good sanding all over before applying the finish, which was black enamel. Now this stand is a fairly simple build and would make a good weekend project even for those with limited tools. All the pieces could be cut with a circular saw or even a handsaw if you're really keen. The holes in the sides aren't necessary as they were just for looks, but could be cut with a jigsaw, as could the curve at the bottom of the sides where the feet are and the cutouts at the front of the top shelf. The shelves can be butt jointed to the sides rather than being recessed in because the stand won't be subject to any strong forces or holding any real weight. Well, I'm really happy with how the stand turned out, and more importantly, the recipient loved it.